Welcome back. I'm really great you're still watching because the last part was quite difficult. I admit that. And the beauty of having a YouTube video is that you can watch it over and over again as many times as you want. And you can also go back and pause and investigate certain lines in your code. So that is truly an advantage compared to the, let's call it the old days when you visited a conference or when you visited a training, a one-day training, and you weren't able to go back a day later and review things. Unless there was a recording, of course, which was not very popular back in the day. So the next stage of our example is going to be fully dedicated to the web application, the web client, so to speak. As a heads up, all the examples only work if our backend is running. That is one of the most common questions, like, you show us a web example and it's not working. Yes, of course, the backend that is being used has to be started as well. So in this case, we need to double click on our Xdata direction server and run it. And of course, we also have to make sure that the Xdata server is started. So in this case, because I disabled the start functionality, that it starts automatically, I have to click start. And in this case, the server is started. Just as a reminder, to create the web application, we can right click on the project group and say add new project. And then we can pick in the TMS web category, the TMS web application. I actually prefer this template to the bootstrap template because with the web template, I can add my bootstrap links that I will use, or my external libraries myself, using content delivery networks so that the server is being used that you're closest to. Whereas the bootstrap application template has the advantage that the template is bundled inside of your application. So you're working with the same version. It's built into your application. It's referenced from your application. It's being deployed onto your web server. That's a major difference to, you can see it like linking in a VCL application if you link something statically into your executable, or if you have a reference to a DLL, you don't know what version that DLL is, right? So that is something you can do with web applications as well that way. And in this case, I opt to reference the bootstrap classes. In this case, I opted to reference the bootstrap classes externally and not host them myself. So let's select the project and start from scratch. I'll explain all the parts of the application, not only functionality, but also the user interface that we're building. I know that a lot of Delphi developers struggle building web interfaces, and there's multiple ways to approach this. I've added a couple of videos for Delphi developers, or specifically for Delphi developers that have been doing a lot of work with the VCL, how to get started with TMS WEB Core. My book gives you 3 steps, so to speak, how to get started with TMS WEB Core using the components only, then using a mix of components and Bootstrap, and then at some point moving over to a solution that uses only the Bootstrap classes with HTML, with only a few components or controls that you need in addition to that. But the components in that case are no longer the reason for your design. The design comes fully out of the HTML. Of course, that is the most advanced version to build TMS WEB Core applications, as it requires, in addition to your Delphi skills, web design skills. And let's be honest here, you haven't learned the VCL in a couple of days either. You know, it took you a couple of iterations to learn how to build good user interfaces with the VCL, and the web is the same. You can't expect to build the perfect web design creating your first application right from scratch, and that's what makes TMS WEB Core so great. You don't have to. You can drop a couple of controls on the form and you have your web application and look at the design later on. So with this all up front, let's go to the main form of the application, which I renamed uForm Directions. That's the main form. I also created the main HTML file as index.html, which means if you deploy later on your web application, let's look at that. So we can right-click here and open the output path in Explorer. That's TMS WEB Core specific. You won't see that in a VCL application. These are the files that you would deploy to a web server, right? In this case, it's the debug version. Of course, you would most likely use the release version without the debugging information. But the key thing here is the index.html, and most web servers allow you to leave out the index.html. So deploying that to a domain, you can use it without adding the index.html at the end. Your web server will understand that automatically, and that will allow you to access your application much easier. The difficulty with this application is it uses the advanced approach with HTML design. So these are just the core controls you need for the user interaction. So we have 1, 2 edit controls, T-Web edits, and we have a button. But none of them have any caption or text or anything. The only thing they have is a name. So if we want to address the button in code, we would use button get directions. If we want to address this edit control, we would use txt origin and txt destination. And now it is becoming pretty clear what this is. This is the edit text field for the origin, this for the destination, and this is the button where you can say, get me the directions. Yes, right? That's the user interaction that we've been writing the backend for. And in the middle of the form, somewhere, we have this map. And what is really, really well hidden, I think I could make it more visible by showing the structure view. This is actually a hint from somebody that watches my videos on a regular basis, saying we see the design, but we don't see the structure of the control. So let's see. I got to be honest, because I never use this. Oh, here we go. So here we see that the map is hosted on a div control. So TMS WEB Core allows you to drop components on top of each other. When we think about the VCL, we don't really think about it. We have a panel, and on that panel, we can host a button or any other control, right? There's ownership there. And the same principle is carried forward from TMS WEB Core to the web using HTML-like controls, like the div. A div is what do you say? A rectangular area, or an area. It doesn't have to be rectangular. It's an area on your, or a container on your HTML document. It hosts other HTML tags. And that's exactly what TMS WEB Core does here. So the div control is used to host the map. And this is one major thing I want to emphasize in this video. And this is, for me, this is the main focus of this part. FNC controls that render themselves onto the canvas, like this map, for example, have to be hosted inside of a div if you want to incorporate them into a bootstrap grid or any other CSS framework grid of some sort. If you're like, what does Olga mean by grid? Let's run the application and I explain it to you if you see the visual appearance of everything. At runtime, the form looks completely different from what it looks like in the Delphi form designer. And that is one of the advantages if you use the Visual Studio Code version of TMS WEB Core. You have what you see is what you get inside of the IDE. You don't have that here in the IDE. There is the option to use the preview feature. There's a video about that on the TMS channel, but still, this is not really needed in this case. For me, it is important to write code for the interaction of these two edit controls with the button and how it works on the map, so to speak. And the design is being formulated in HTML using Bootstrap classes. And the developer console gives us much more than just network traffic. it also allows us to look at the makeup or the design of the page. So, for example, if we click here, we can investigate all the different elements. That's easy. However, we can also look at the grid. So here we see that is the row. And this row hosts, as you can see, 1, 2, 3 columns. And these columns, of course, have been defined in some kind of bootstrap syntax. But the key is, this is what I refer to when I talk about the grid. I'm not talking about a grid like a VCL grid that allows you to enter data. No, I'm talking about the grid that creates the layout. And if you've watched one of my previous Bootstrap videos, you know that the Bootstrap grid reserves 12 columns, so to speak, for the total width of the page. And this column here has 5 elements. This one has 5. And 5 plus 5 is 10. So there's 2 left. So this one here most likely is going to be 2. So we reserve the full width of the page, saying this takes 5/12, this takes 5/12, and this takes 2/12. Yes, compound fractures, they follow you all through life, even in web design. And here, the map obviously is just one column, right? And if we have to be a little bit careful here because it's difficult, and if it's too difficult to point at with the mouse, we can click. And here on the right, we get the source, and we can expand. And there we see that we have the div, which is the map container, and our map hosted inside of that container. And the names are literally taken out of our form design. So for example, here we just said like map container. And if we look at the element, right here we see element ID is div map. The number one reason why we need the div is FNC controls don't have an element ID because they can consist of multiple elements that are being rendered, right? And the map is not as much the problem, but still we don't have an element ID here. So the only way to link it to our grid is using here the div, and the div can then be linked to our HTML using the element ID div map. So if we go back here, we say here in the div ID div map. So actually, this is the hosting container. You can see that on the left because it's highlighted in blue. And this is actually the FNC map control. And this is something that is being generated here. This map container is generated by FNC maps. This is actually where the map is being hosted. This is nothing I defined, and they call it map container. So this is the outside, and then here is the control that I dropped on the form. And if you go farther up, you have here the one column which takes up the total width. Interestingly, you can edit this live. So I could say 10 if I only wanted to use 10, right? And then here, I would also basically say why this doesn't update the FNC. Oh, of course, because it is a canvas control, it doesn't update live. So let me use one of the ones up here. So live preview with, or live changes with FNC controls, not a good idea. So let's go up here into this one. So we have here the 3 columns. Let's see, you decide, oh, this is too wide. Let's make this, for example, only 4. And right away, the design changes. But now you have 1 column left, right? Because 4 plus 5 plus 2 is only 11. It's not 12. So you could do, for example, here you could do 3, which doesn't make any sense because the button is only that long, right? So you can change it back to 2. And you could, for example, say, hey, insert, make this 6 because the destination is always longer, like this, for example. Or what you could do, which is another very, very helpful command, when starting with Bootstrap, you could do offset. So in front of the column, you say offset 1. That means 1 column offset, and then this stays empty. And the visualization is really, really nice. As you can see here, the orange part is the offset, and then the column starts. So that, again, I'm diverting again, but I know that you, or a lot of people, appreciate more tinkering with Bootstrap to get a feel. And this is what I want to encourage you to do. Play with this. Really, really play with this and change the dynamics of the page in order to learn how Bootstrap reacts when you make these changes. The key thing to remember is that these are real controls, or that these HTML input elements that you can see right here are linked to the controls on the form right here. And that is done through the so-called element ID. So here we have the element ID input origin, and here the element ID input destination. And you can see those if you click on the control right here. And then you have here input and their ID input origin. So the ID of the HTML control is the link between the control on the form and the HTML tag. Very, very important to remember is that the Delphi control always takes over, meaning if, for example, you define something here in the HTML and you define something in addition here in this control, that takes over if you don't overwrite it at runtime then. So that's the reason why I clear out the text for the edit controls and the caption for the buttons, so that nothing is in there, so that really everything from the HTML is being used. Let's look at it inside of the Delphi IDE. I hope you appreciate that I took the approach using the developer console this time, so you get a completely different approach this time to learn about a web page. Instead of just looking at the source, we look at the layout first and then use the developer console to browse the content. So this double click here always gives us the code. But if we expand this, we also get the HTML. And this is exactly where we find the definition for the form. And it's really not that complicated, I promise, because I'm really not a good web designer. And the skill here is to learn from the templates that are given in the Bootstrap documentation. But there's also a tool called Bootstrap Studio, which is also not that expensive, that you can use to create a layout and then convert that layout over if you don't want to write the HTML yourself. Other tools are, for example, Figma. That's something I'm looking at myself right now, if I can optimize my process to build pages, if I can become more efficient using these tools. However, if I become more efficient with it and I think it's useful, you'll certainly know about it, because then you'll get a video on this very channel about it. But right now, I'm still learning myself, so please be patient for any Figma-related things. So with regards to the design, the Bootstrap documentation emphasizes or suggests to use a container. The P5 in this means I have a padding, and then you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The lower the number, the less padding, and because it's just P, it means it's in all directions, meaning top, bottom, left, right. Or to be more multicultural, we have top, bottom, trailing, and leading. Okay, because left is not really a good term to use if you develop for the web, because left in the United States is definitely not left in all countries that write from right to left, right? So that would change. So it's actually better to talk about leading and trailing. Leading for left and trailing for right. And top bottom obviously doesn't change. So with that in mind, P5 means the padding is applied on the top, on the bottom, on the left, and on the right. And then I create a row. And notice that I stack up these div tags, a row, and I align items at the end. And that is something that you could tinker with, for example. So here we go into the row right here. What happens if I take that out? What happens is that the button at the right might jump to the top, because if you look here, the label is part of the column, right? So if I do it like this, the button is aligned with the destination, with the label here. So I have to align all the content at the bottom, and that way the button is also on the bottom. So it's all in alignment with the edit fields. Just a little trick here. Okay, so with that, going back to Delphi, and I only explained the first one. So we have a column, size 5. We have a label for the input control, this is the input control. The class is form control. The class for the label is form label. The ID has to be specified because that's how we link Delphi to it, and the type is text both times. And for the button, we have class button primary, nothing specific, and that's it for the interaction with the controls. To link it up, as we just have a few controls, I dropped them manually. I dropped 2 TWeb edits. I dropped 1 TWeb button, named them, right? The name here doesn't have to be the same name as in the HTML. I usually pick the same name, but you don't have to. It's not required. If you get the design from a web designer, you don't have to tell the web designer what to name the IDs. If the web designer has a different naming scheme than you have, no problem. You just have to link it once. So in this case, because they're named the same, this button here is supposed to be linked to button get directions in our HTML, right? Here, this button here has the ID button get directions. So we specify the element ID button get directions. And if the form has been set to CSS Bootstrap, when you drop the button, it's automatically flipping over to element font to EF CSS, meaning the font of the button is not taken from the property of the form, no, or from the property of the button. No, it's taken from the CSS, meaning from Bootstrap in this case. With regards to the height style, it also flips to SS Auto. Why? Because you set it to Bootstrap. The form is a Bootstrap form, so TMS WEB Core knows, oh, so I have to adjust the height automatically because Bootstrap is in control. The width right now is still absolute, meaning it is given as the button is, but I can assure you the size you will be able to adjust the size by simply setting this to SS Auto as well, and then Bootstrap can take over. So those are all things to consider when you link up your HTML controls. Usually, this is all the customization I do on the Delphi side. Everything else is in the HTML. You just have to be careful that if you write, for example, a caption in here, hello, and then start your application, the hello might overwrite what you have defined inside of your HTML. That's the thing I wanted to emphasize too. So now this is hello, even though our HTML has a different one, get directions. So just leave it empty, because if you leave it empty and compile, it's not being overwritten. Obviously, there could be a different implementation to this. This is the current state. I think it is quite manageable. Right there, get directions. You also might consider, why hasn't TMS done anything? Because if you localize your applications, you might load the captions and the text and all that kind of stuff at runtime anyways. So yes, it is not optimal if this is by default going to web button 1, for example. You drop it, it always overwrites your HTML. Yes, that's not optimal, but we know how it works, so just remove the caption. And the same is true for the text property of the edit controls. Just remove the text, and the text will be taken from your HTML. If the HTML is also empty, it will stay empty. But in this case, I use default values, I think. right here somewhere. Let's see, in the web form create, I set these. This is where the addresses come from, hard-coded, nothing fancy. It's also not being stored in local storage or anything like that. It's literally just hard-coded in there. Those are the default values for origin and destination. The final part of the design is the map in the middle. Right now, this is a TMS FNC Maps control. FNC Maps is a commercial product from TMS as well. You need to purchase FNC Maps. Specifically, if you have all access, you don't care, but FNC Maps is a component suite for the FNC framework, and it gives you all these different components for adding maps for VCL, FireMonkey, and the web, and also directions, geocoding, and all that stuff. I've emphasized this, but of course, your web application then needs these to be compiled, right? So your web client depends on FNC Maps. And I've had this question before because in my TMS WEB Core book, there is a Google map in there, but there is no FNC Maps. I have a separate FNC Maps book. So how is it possible that there is a Google map in my TMS WEB Core book? Well, simple, because if you go to the TMS Web System or Services, I think it's Web Services right here, these are included with TMS WEB Core. They have nothing to do with TMS FNC Maps. And if you look here, we have Google Chart and all these kind of things. And we have, where is it? Google Maps. So that would allow you to use a Google map. So no FNC, same approach though. Drop it inside of a div control in order to include it in your bootstrap framework, so to speak. But you can use this control without using FNC Maps. Of course, you don't have any of the features of FNC Maps, meaning if FNC Maps can draw certain things on a map that this standard control can, you're out of luck. However, in this case, our backend gives us the directions, gives us all the coordinates, so we should be able to use TWeb Google Maps instead of using FNC Maps on the client side. And this kind of shows you, like, if your backend is well thought through, especially when looking at other clients. If the backend gives you all the information that you need, you can literally create your web clients slimmer with less controls or components, because the power of FNC Maps is really in the backend now. It's no longer in the front end. The front end is just showing things on a map, and that can be done with this control, which you might also, for example, find if you're looking at a iOS client, for example. You will find this as part of iOS because iOS has, by default, Apple Maps now. So you would be able, with the coordinates that are being delivered from the backend, you would be able to draw these coordinates on the map, and you would also be able to generate a table on the iPhone or whatever device you use for the directions that are being generated by the backend. However, and this, I don't know if I announced this here. I got the permission from TMS to do this because this is actually not a release version of TMS WEB Core. I'm pretty privileged that Bruno Fearens allows me to access certain release states, development release states. So it's not a release, it's like development versions from TMS WEB Core. And this one is from, what do we have now? This is January 16th. And I notice we have a TWeb leaflet maps component in there. That's just great because that means compared to Google, leaflet doesn't require an API key. Leaflet maps are open source or whatever you want to call it. Leaflet maps are non-commercial maps, right? If you want to. It depends on the tile server that you use, but in general, you don't need an API key. And you can use it without any licensing restrictions. As said, the only tricky part might be the tile server that you use. So looking at that, this is the way we want to go, right? Why would we use, in this case, FNC Maps if we can have the same thing with web leaflet maps, right? So guess what? In the next episode, I'm going to show you, in case you have any other control, how we can transfer over from this FNC maps here over to this web leaflet maps, because that will allow us to compile our web client without FNC maps. And we have a map control that is not costing us anything, because Google, yes, it might look free at first, but only for so many views. At some point, Google is going to charge you for the service, whereas Leaflet is not going to charge you. And you don't need an API key. So this is really a great solution for a web client and the backend. The backend, however, if you wonder why is Holger suggesting something not using a TMS product that he used before, and TMS is sponsoring his video series, is he crazy? No, I'm not crazy. The backend is still using Xdata, right? With TMS FNC maps, because the backend needs the power of FNC maps in order to give us the direction instructions. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to have the turn-by-turn instructions, the coordinates for the routing instructions. That's why we need FNC maps. However, on the front end, we don't need it at all. The only thing we want to do on the front end is place two markers, start, end, or origin, destination, and a line in between. And then on the bottom here, we want to generate a table. So let's finish with that. The table on the bottom is underneath the map. So the map is right here. And the map is hosted, as I already explained, on one column that spans the full size. And the ID is div map. That's it. And from there, we have another row with border, rounded border. So the border comes actually from the div that is being drawn around the directions, if you remember what it looked like when I showed off the application at first. And then I reserve space for one column, full size of the screen, and I call it ID hook table. And we'll look at that in one of the final episodes of this tutorial. We will generate the table for the driving instructions in code. We won't use JavaScript or anything crazy like that, but we're going to generate it dynamically. And this approach for this kind of stuff, in my opinion, is much, much better than using, especially if you use a HTML approach, is much better than trying to make a component or a control from TMS fit into your grid, because TMS builds so much power into their controls that stuff from Bootstrap might get overwritten, for example. And then it is harder to disable that functionality or to even derive your own control than simply using the DOM, the domain object model from HTML, to generate the table on the page. And TMS WEB Core has a great classes for these kind of things. So you're not writing code that wouldn't be checked at compile time, but still you have a better option than just dropping a control and then customizing that control. It's much easier to use a couple of for loops in order to generate the table. That's it for now. In the next part, we'll replace this map with the new TWeb leaflet maps component.